Welcome inside the Woody Hayes Athletic Center, where Ohio State learned this afternoon that it will be playing Tennessee in the first round of the college football playoff. The Buckeyes set to host the Volunteers in a Saturday night game at Ohio Stadium, a rarity there. The Buckeyes preparing to play the Volunteers on December 21 in a first round game at Ohio Stadium. And Andy, maybe not the best draw for Ohio State when you look at the bracket, the Buckeyes facing the possibility, if they can get past Tennessee, of having to play Oregon, the number one seed in the second round. There was some thought, maybe the Buckeyes could move up, jump Penn State maybe after Penn State lost to Oregon in the Big Ten championship. But ultimately, and Ryan Day said this himself, the Buckeyes can't complain about their seed. They have to be happy with what they got because they lost to Michigan. They lost their opportunity to effectively control their own destiny and go get the number one seed if they could have beat Oregon in Indianapolis on Saturday night. Instead, they had to watch from home. The committee chooses not to punish teams for losing in conference championship games, which I think is very fair and just. And as a result, Ohio State now has a challenging path if it's going to make a national championship run. But good news for the Buckeyes is they're in the dance. They've got a shot, and they do get to host a first-round game.
Yeah, the only shot for Ohio State to move up based on the weekend's results really was for Penn State to fall behind them. And off a one-score loss with Oregon, I think you keep that buffer team in between Ohio State and Penn State of Notre Dame, right? So you're not comparing them head-to-head and say, well, Ohio State went to Penn State's place and beat them. So you get that. I think the seeding makes a lot of sense in the end for Ohio State because you did lose a game against a pretty middling Michigan team to end the year. And you end up now hosting Tennessee, who I think out of the teams they could have played in this first round might be one of the worst matchups. I think when you take Ohio State's offensive line concerns and what's happening there, and Tennessee has a very talented defensive front. Ryan Day spoke to that a little bit after a question you asked him here today. And I'm curious to see how that works out. And it sounds like there's some moving parts even along that offensive line for Ohio State, or at least some consideration of some moving parts.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt you'd rather play Indiana. You've already blown them out once here at Ohio Stadium. You'd rather play SMU or Clemson. I think all of those would be more favorable matchups for the Buckeyes. But again, they're the 8th seed, so they're supposed to have the least favorable matchups of the teams hosting in the first round, and I think they definitely do. They are still a 7 to 7.5 point favorite on the opening line for this game, and so I think this is certainly a winnable game for the Buckeyes, but not going to be an easy game. And like you said, I think a lot of it certainly is going to start with that offensive line. Can the Buckeyes figure something out with that group up front after they had such a poor game in that area, particularly running the ball against Michigan? And certainly the offensive game plan is going to be in focus too. How does Ohio State make sure it puts its best players, its wide receivers, its standout running backs, how does it put those guys in positions to be successful? Because Ryan Day said it as much as anybody. They didn't do that against Michigan. They have to do it against Tennessee because now it's make or break. We don't need to get into the whole Ryan Day's job on the line stuff today because we've talked about that a lot already. But every game is a must-win game now. You win, you advance. You lose, you're out. And so the pressure is going to be on for the Buckeyes going into that game. But I'm pretty excited for it, man. I mean, you think about when we thought about this 12-team playoff starting and what it had the potential to be. These are the kind of games you dreamed of. An SEC team coming north to Ohio Stadium to play the Buckeyes in the middle of December. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, and a night game. Fans have been clamoring for that home atmosphere at night. It's been pretty sparse here, and of course, Ohio State had a pretty pointed stance that it wasn't going to play 3:30 night kicks after or in November.
It was just night kicks.
In night kicks in November. Sorry, yes, in November night kicks. They had that stance before, but they kind of get their hand forced, and now you're going to get a really raucous environment in the shoe. I really do. People have criticized, I think, in the wake of the Michigan loss, some of the stuff with the crowd booing in the second half, and there was a lot of frustration felt, but those atmospheres were still electric. I think that the Michigan atmosphere, when it was loud, when the game was, still in a place where it looked like Ohio State might win, that atmosphere was great. The Indiana game was great and loud, and so I'm really excited for that college football environment. No doubt it will be rocking for a home playoff game against an SEC team coming north. and just the mystique of that. They called it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and to this point, it's hard to disagree with them. Pretty much impossible. Ohio State's never played a home game in December, so this is going to be a spectacle. To the offensive line points, I think you talk about moving pieces. I was curious to hear Josh Padilla and Luke Montgomery brought up as the two guys that are kind of in consideration to maybe shift some things up front. You wonder how that would look. They did say that they are probably going to stick with Donovan Jackson at left tackle. Last week he had floated out the possibility of him sliding inside, but stick with Donovan at tackle. I think Josh Padilla and Luke Montgomery are kind of being evaluated amongst that interior. Maybe you could see Padilla in at center, and that kicks Carson Hinson back out to guard where he's been better. But for me, that offensive line, when you're talking about the nuts and bolts of this Tennessee matchup, is where it's going to be won and lost. So that's the number one issue to address, along with better scheme from Ohio State's offense, maybe especially if you're worried about the offensive line and trying to scheme around maybe some of those weaknesses. And like you said, get the ball to those weapons out wide.
Yeah, I don't really think there was a realistic option of moving Donovan Jackson inside, even though Ryan Day had mentioned that last week. I mean, Zen Mahalski is still considered unavailable because of the injury he suffered against Nebraska. But even if he was, he did not play well enough against Nebraska to be a viable option. And you look at this Tennessee defensive front, I mean, James Pierce Jr. is one of the best pass rushers in the country. He's been projected as a first-round pick in the 2025 NFL draft. So I think protecting those edges first and foremost is going to be a huge key for the offensive line in this game. Certainly they need better play for the interior offensive line as well, but sounds like, I think really all three of those spots could be open for competition here over the next couple of weeks, with Joshua Padilla having that potential to push Carson Hinzman at center. If they do make a change at center, Carson Hinzman could always move out to guard. And then you have Luke Montgomery, who's going to be in that mix as well. So it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out. Not really a position you want to be in this time of year when you're looking at potential changes on your offensive line going into a college football playoff game. We've seen that when this team has had to make reshuffles, a lot of times they've struggled initially with those reshuffles. So it's not an ideal situation to be in, but it's one that they have to make the best of it, because the reality is Josh Simmons is out for the season. Seth McLaughlin's out for the season. Without those two guys, their offensive line is not as good as it was when they had them, but they have to do their best to make the best of it. And Ryan Day did seem to have real confidence today that he thinks this team is ready for this. He thinks this team has what it takes to go make a run. Now, I think he was very confident they were going to beat Michigan too. So, it doesn't really mean a whole lot until you actually get out there on the field. But it does seem like he's going into this game with the right mindset. It sounds like, after last week he had talked about there was still mixed emotions. It feels like now that they know their target, they know who they're going to be going to play in 13 days from now, it seems like they're back in the right mindset now and ready to go chase a championship.
Yeah, I think, like he said, 3 or 4 days to process that loss, figure out what went wrong, figure out and just get those emotions out. But now you move on to working towards and game planning and having that specific opponent, like you said. And this is a chance, for an Ohio State roster that is still one of the most talented in the country. I think you'd agree. I think a lot of people would agree with that, to go on a run and do something that, while, I don't think a lot of people are expecting this Ohio State team to go out and win a national championship, they still have a roster capable of doing it. And Ryan Day said it too. Every team in the playoff is flawed. I don't think there's a team that you look at and say Ohio State is incapable of beating that team. I think that's something of a bit of confidence. I mean, they lost by 1 point to the number 1 seed on the road. They beat Penn State, who's ahead of them. They smashed Indiana, who is also in the playoff. Like, this Ohio State team is capable of going on the run. It's just, what do you have to figure out on the offensive side of the ball to get that working again? Can the defense keep playing elite as it has since that Oregon game? And I think Tennessee is a great first test, and then you get a rematch with Oregon if you beat Tennessee. So you're going to find out really quickly if this team is capable of a championship run.
Well, as Ryan Day said, they got to take it one game at a time. Tennessee is not going to be an easy opponent, so that's where all the Buckeyes' focus is, on beating the Volunteers, and we'll have a lot more coverage coming up the next couple of weeks leading up to that Ohio State versus Tennessee game. So we hope you stay with us over on 11warriors.com, 11 Warriors YouTube channel. For press coverage, I'm Dan Hope. He's Andy Anders. We'll catch you next time.